But Clough didn't bother playing it cool and chose not to bide his time. Jimmy Hill was lurking with a counter-offer after all. Accordingly, there was little brinkmanship involved, with Clough happy to pay the fee, although he would later insist that the final figure was £1 short of £1 million. The VAT applied to the fee ensured it wasn't. Francis, understandably preferring to move to the league champions than to Coventry, whose last piece of silverware was the second division title back in 1967, was summoned to the City ground. There, he, Clough and Peter Taylor shut themselves away for a 4-hour meeting to thrash out terms. Back then, phrases such as sell-on fee and buyout clauses weren't part of football's lexicon. There was also a distinct lack of agents, advisors and directors of football adding their two penneth. It was the way Clough liked to work. Man to man, cards on the bloody table, plain dealing. Not that there was anything especially unusual about the setup. This was largely the way transfers were negotiated at the time. The Dutch midfielder Arnold Muren once told me that the first he knew of Ipswich's interest in him back in 1978 was when Bobby Robson himself turned up at his house in Volendam. Robson set out the terms of the deal right there in Muren's kitchen, with no protracted multilateral discussions to muddy the waters. Laurie McMenemy signed Charlie George during the same season. The negotiations involved the Southampton boss picking up George in London and driving him back to the McMenemy homestead in Hampshire, where the striker stayed overnight. The contract discussions began between just the two of them the following morning after breakfast. Transfer negotiations have long since not been such intimate affairs. We live in the age of the entourage. Sign a player today, says Harry Redknapp, and you sometimes need to find a bigger office just to accommodate all the people who are brought along to do the deal. Agents, advisors, lawyers, PR experts, uncles, aunts and mates. Even if Francis's record-breaking move had taken place in the era of agents and entourages, Clough would certainly have given any representatives extremely short shrift, and almost certainly an extended interrogation over how the agent could possibly justify any sizable personal recompense for what they'd contributed to the deal. As it was, without any agent's cut, Francis reportedly banked £50,000 himself as part of the deal. Being the most expensive British footballer didn't accord Francis any special privileges, though. When he was presented to the clamouring press, it was Clough who hogged the limelight. Arriving in gym kit and brandishing a squash racket, the manager was clearly impatient to get to the courts at Trent Bridge Cricket Ground just around the corner. The mildly shambolic proceedings undermined Francis, who had arrived at the City ground in his Jaguar with his glamorous wife Helen, described by eyewitness Duncan Hamilton as looking like a catwalk model from Paris, swathed in a massive fur coat. Clough's reluctance to treat Francis like a high-value commodity continued as soon as the press conference was over, with the new arrival being dealt with in a manner that a 21st century player would not remotely recognise. First, Francis was pitched straight into a Midland Youth League game on a local park's pitch. Then, unavailable to play in Forest's European Cup campaign unless they reached the final, he was placed on tea-making duties during the quarter-final against the Swiss side Grasshoppers, forced to serve hot beverages to his teammates at half-time. While not exactly suggesting that Francis was on his uppers and had been forced into a life of servitude, he had, after all, topped up his regular earnings the previous summer by trousering another 50 grand lump sum for turning out 19 times for Detroit Express in the North American Soccer League. The story comes from a time when clubs held most, if not all, the cards. It wasn't until the mid-90s that the tables were turned, thanks to legal action taken against the Royal Belgian Football Association by an unremarkable midfielder who played for RFC de Liège. The ruling that colloquially took the name of the plaintiff, Jean-Marc Bosman, had a profound effect on British and European football that's near impossible to measure. In December 1995, a ruling was finally made on a 5-year legal battle. Earlier in his career, with his contract having expired, Bosman had hoped to move across the French border to Dunkirk, but found that RFC de Liège were refusing to release him. Believing such an action to be in contravention of EU freedom of movement legislation, Bosman took his case all the way to the European Court of Justice, who found in his favour. Football transfers would never be the same again. Players now had the right to run their contracts down.